The Ulster Cycle of myths stalked me in disguise from the shadows for a long time. Hullen and the heroes of the Red Branch, the Creve Rua, the Curse of Macha, the dreamlike ancient kingdom of Awan Macha. Ulster's forgotten mythology still lived and breathed in hiding, it seemed, secretly passed on through word of mouth. Hullen, Ireland's greatest hero, the Hound Slayer, a synonym for Irish courage, Ulster's king and Connacht's queen. But I didn't know anything about them. I hadn't read the tales, only heard whispers on childhood breezes. Unconsciously, the stories were maybe a way not just to preserve what felt like a defeated and deflated northern Celtic culture, but to feel it. To feel anything with pride that wasn't a dressed-up revenge atrocity through the late years of the Troubles and into the first decade of the ceasefire. Underneath the parasitic ideologies of nationalism lies a wholesome, ancient, divine soul filtered through clean waters, honourable deeds and courage, full of wild lands and, of course, confusing goddesses. Living in London for more than a decade, the sight of Awan Macha, known as Navan Fort today, seemed to exert a stronger pull on me the longer I stayed away, always coming up in rambling pub talks, a swelling identity pride from someone who'd walked the land but never understood, an Irish soul in shadow, unconscious, someone who'd forgotten in a long line of men who'd forgotten. I was so proud of Hullen and the Ulster Cycle, delighting in the fact I could claim an attachment through my surname, but never thought to ask why, or even who on earth that was and what all these things meant. As a young child, I only remember going to Navan Fort once. My Uncle John walked my brother and I to it one day, probably to tire us out, through winding and back then deserted country roads, back when Armagh was a raw and wild place compared to today. People lived relentlessly in the moment because, for a lot of people, the next moment wasn't guaranteed. We set out from Mullacreevy, a tough housing estate at the top of a wind-blasted hill overlooking Armagh city on one side and the ancient site of Awan Macha on the other. Beautiful rolling greenfield views all around, which, at the time, meant nothing to me, living as children do in the immediate beauty of life. There was no moment of clarity or profundity that day. Just a hill, windswept and green. Interesting for its circular moats and climbing opportunities, its strangely shaped mound. Maybe a connection was made there and then, one imperceptible to me, a seed, an acorn that would grow over years into a sacred oak, a crumb of consciousness that would struggle to be seen, something my DNA recognised, a home from a previous life. How far northern consciousness had fallen from its land was not apparent for a long, long time. Only recently did I begin to grapple with what the bizarre tales that make up the Ulster Cycle of mythology may mean, what they're trying to tell us about ourselves in this troubled land under the layers of shadow and dirt accumulated over the aeon. This series of podcasts have come from actually reading these stories closely for the first time, applying the lenses of Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, Marie-Louise van Franz and Robert Bly, just to name a few. But importantly, and the hardest to say and talk about, is the role the site of Awan Macha played and continues to play in this journey. Now, when I say the site, I don't just mean what the history or mythology of the site has to tell us, but what the goddess in the mound has to communicate directly. This is difficult to say out loud. As a Northern Irish male, it's hard to say that the land can speak, that there is a literal relationship there, that you gain as much through a walk in the fields as you can from a book on the subject. Although the Ulster Cycle, especially its main epic, the Tain, doesn't mention much about her, the living embodiment of the sacred feminine, the dark feminine, lives here in the mound of Macha's twins. Armagh, Ard Macha, the height of the goddess, is here, and it's not for nothing that the site bears the name of the wrathful yet redemptive feminine spirit. But I'll get to all that in time. These podcasts are about what I see in the Ulster Cycle, and it's quite literally a humble opinion. I have no qualifications, no authority bestowed on me from an accredited institution to speak on Irish mythology, just that granted by the land and my own sovereign heart. Robert Bly talks about the wet, the moist as opposed to the dry. Overly intellectual or scientific descriptions are said to be dry, adding some heart, subjective beauty, wisdom that makes it wetter. And this is very much the spirit of these explorations. Damp, let's say. And that's a very northern Celtic way to look at the world. We're open, loud, aggressively friendly. Emotion, feeling and expression via the long route, repressed and released in shadow, but expressed nonetheless. We've never been an overly rational or calm people. The spirit of the North rampages and asks questions later, a bit like Hullen himself. We admire heroics and strength. Morality and objective reflection comes later. The most famous story in the Ulster Cycle of around 80 tales, and the main centrepiece of the Ulster Cycle, is the Tain Boculla, or the cattle raid at Cooley, usually shortened to the Tain, a wild story of an attempt by the Queen of Connacht to steal the prize bull from Ulster. The Ulstermen, cursed with weakness, are unable to fight, and it falls to the young warrior Hullen to single-handedly stave off the invading army alone. In this series of podcasts, I'll use the Tain as the main thrust and dip in and out of the other stories as we go. And it's incredible to see, upon first opening the Tain, that northern spirit embodied, not just in the men fighting for the defence of Ulster, but in the literal words on the page. The text conveys the body, masculine, fighting zest for life found in the northern folk. In such stark contrast to the stiffer Greek or Roman or biblical mythologies, the Irish and the Northern Irish, the Ulster mythology bounces out of the book, bawling and yelling, swearing and drinking, irreverent, blunt, defiant, and somehow yelling. The Tain in part has such energy in its prose. Here's a small fragment of Hullen racing down a hill to knock his enemies to kingdom come. Quote, "The hero's light sprang from his forehead, long and thick as a warrior's whetstone, long as a prow, and he clattered with rage as he wielded the shields, urging his charioteer on and raining stones on the massed army. Then thick, steady, strong, high as the mast of a tall ship was the straight spout of dark blood that rose up from the font of his skull to dissolve in an otherworldly mist, like the smoke that hangs above a royal hunting lodge when a king comes to be looked after at the close of a winter's day." Unquote. Words galloping across a landscape with energy, fury, and otherworldly cadence. And that's the Tain, otherworldly. The whole story is a phantasmagoria, a bizarre, wild, and morally very different world. One where women are free and authoritative and just as dangerous as men. Morality in that world is not measured at how kind or harmless you are, but with how much gusto you grab life and dominate it, spurning weakness, standing alone against thousands and running like a madman headlong into the fray anyway. And although I've never had an experience like that and recoil at the thought, there is a refreshing zest to it all, a literary bucket of cold water to the face, a primal scream somewhere in the back of my working from home life mind, a bubbling energy that says, "Remember that? Remember washing your face in rivers, being barefoot in snow, wood smoke, kings and queens, blood oaths, a brief breach in the collective amnesia afflicting us all." The copy of the Tain I'm working from is the translation by Kieran Carson, a man whose very name seems to bridge the inherent Ulster divide, which is fitting because these podcasts are not only for one side of the fence in Ulster, but very relevant to both. Mr. Carson is a very likeable guy. His poem Fear perfectly sums up the issues and anxieties of the modern Ulsterman. Quote, "I fear the vast dimensions of eternity. I fear the gap between the platform and the train. I fear the onset of a murderous campaign. I fear the palpitations caused by too much tea." Unquote. There are plenty of academic texts on the Tain and its history and the technicalities of the translations, which I don't want to get too bogged down in. Instead, I want to read the texts and speak my own words and thoughts on it and see what comes out. The Tain is a story that cements Hullen's legacy as Ireland's greatest hero, taking on the whole of the invading army single-handed as a youth of just 17. Again, this tale is known to most Irish people, but when it comes to actually reading the text, Cuchullin's deeds are so fantastical, strange, scary, and in some cases nonsensical, as to make you wonder, what exactly is Cuchullen? What is the motivation of the writer or writers of such a myth? Why write something like a dream sequence rather than just a plain story? Well, here's where it gets interesting for me. I don't believe anyone initially wrote the Ulster Cycle tales, but rather they emerged from the primordial depths, filtered through the soil and found their way onto the tips of the tongues of the people that grew out of the land. Cuchullen maybe had a different name in pre-Celtic eons. Joseph Campbell makes the case in his book The Hero with a Thousand Faces that the same hero journey myths appear all over the world, with the same basic structure, just with tweaks to reflect the culture in which the story is set. Cuchullen has divine heritage, being the son of the Celtic sun god Lu and a mortal woman. He is fearless, but suffers from uncontrollable rage, has unique weaponry in the form of the Gaebolga, has a number of quests, and is destined for a tragic life and early death. This is a very similar description of Achilles in the ancient Greek epics, with some similarities to Hercules. This description can also be applied to Krishna in ancient Indian mythology within his various warrior incarnations, which is so far removed from Irish mythology and much older than the Irish hero myth, but still follows the same overarching form. These patterns don't just show up in stories, they show up in dreams as well. The great Carl Jung called these archetypes, eternally recurring patterns of human behaviour. Jung believed that myth was the representation of these eternal forces dramatised. Similar to dreams, myths are collective dreams. Archetypes are like spirits, deep patterns of energy, mysterious, formless, and unfathomable. We must give them faces and form, narrative, in order for our puny human minds to understand. Santa Claus is a good example. What does Santa and Cuchullen have in common? You might say neither exist. It's quite rare to find an adult who believes in Santa. If one says he does, you wouldn't take it seriously. But in order to open up mythologies, a different way of thinking is required. What is Santa? A fat guy in a red suit with a beard who delivers presents at Christmas? Well, no. The man with the beard is the personification, the symbol of something unfathomable. We need to give human faces to forces we can't grasp. Think of Neptune, the Roman god of the sea, whose brothers are Jupiter, the sky, and Pluto, the underworld, surface and depth. Here is a person Roman sailors could pray to and appease for safe passage, even though the man figure of Neptune, was not the sea itself. It was just a symbol that represented something much bigger and uncontrollable, the spirit of the sea as such. But just because the symbol doesn't exist, doesn't mean the sea doesn't exist. Santa is the spirit of Christmas, the ancient energy that runs through that time of the European year, the deep winter, the darkest point where the lights are found. We've created an avatar made up of old pagan symbols, sleigh, reindeer, and personal attributes, large belly and smile, signifying abundance and kindness. As the spirit of Christmas, the all-pervading energy of the season, Santa's job is to provide children with gifts on Christmas Eve. People claim Santa doesn't exist because how could one man deliver billions of presents in one night? Yet, billions of presents appear in one night under the trees of the children every Christmas. The spirit of giving, the essence of Christmas in its unfathomable form, infuses the season with an energy that motivates billions of people to become Santa's helpers. But the children know. They'll ask questions like, if there's no such thing as Santa, who leaves all the presents under the tree? The cynical older child or grown-up will say, oh, that's just your parents, and the conversation stops there. But the child is on to something. The next question should be, why do the parents do it? Why do billions of parents move heaven and earth to ensure this all happens every December? And it's because the spirit of Christmas, the living dynamics of the tradition itself, the force that is the very fabric of the season, is active and energized and has the power to motivate. We can't see that force, so we invent a symbol for it in the form of a jolly fat guy on a sleigh. The symbol doesn't exist, not in the form that we think of it. but Santa definitely does. Otherwise, nothing would happen at Christmas. And that symbol is updated as times change. What the hell has this all got to do with Hullen? Well, looking at Hullen through the Jungian lens, he still exists. The energy, the archetype of the young hero still runs through the land of Ulster. And here's the thing, it's older than any conception of Irish. The symbol is dressed in Celtic clothes, but the substance of the energy is certainly not Celtic. It can affect anyone on the land. Hullen to me is an eternal pattern of behaviour that runs through the north, and by understanding it, we can explain our own behaviour. As a younger man abroad, when people ask me what the Troubles were all about, I sometimes answered quite honestly, I think there's something in the land, not knowing quite how right that may have been. Jung characterised archetypes as riverbeds. Once an archetype loses its energy, it becomes dry and dormant. But when it flows again with water, psychic energy poured into the caked mud runway, it reactivates and flows again. This energises the symbol. For example, if Christmas disappeared and everyone forgot about it, there would be no Santa symbol, but the archetype would still exist, just in a dormant form, a dry riverbed. If large swaths of people then rediscovered Christmas, the energy of their being conscious of the archetype would re-energise the symbol, and the river would flow again, coursing through the time and place. Christ is similar. Once the symbol became something conscious in thousands, then millions, that archetype became incredibly powerful and changed the face of the world. When I read the Ulster Cycle, I see this process at work. Firstly, the fact that we call these Irish mythological bodies of work cycles is strange in itself. They fall out of consciousness periodically, and when the symbols are reignited, they are so powerful that the effects can be devastating if the process is not understood, if it is unconscious or in shadow. When I look at the Tain sitting on my shelf or lying around on the sofa or desk, it's easy to just see a book. But it and the whole Ulster Cycle are so much more than just words on a page. They are a window into the nature of the collective soul of this land. They have the power to radically transform. The famine of the 1840s was the last nail in the coffin ship for the Irish language. Large parts of the country then were illiterate, with most of the peasantry having no concept of even being Irish, of who they really were, of the spectacular lineages that they came from. Irish mythology, just like the language, was unknown, except for the bits and pieces known orally. Most people lived in a state akin to mine described at the beginning. Similar to Christians in the Bible, most Christians haven't read the Bible themselves. They know the fundamentals from the tongues of others and from church services, but only when they sit down and read the words do they finally see that really they didn't have the full picture. Before 1902, translations of the Ulster Cycle were dry, academic, complicated affairs. Most translators omitted the more graphic and scandalous parts to protect the poor, vulnerable population. Then came along the cultural revival. People like A. Russell, W.B. Yeats, James Joyce, Lady Gregory, who had the time and inclination to revisit the old tales, who wished to raise the consciousness of the nation through the reignition of ancient Irish mythology. A. Russell said, quote, "Nations have souls as individuals have souls, and they are born, grow, and decay according to spiritual laws. The old symbols were not inventions, but visions. Ireland must find her soul again, or perish." Unquote. W.B. Yeats, quote, "A nation is held together by its myths, not by its police. I wish to create a little world made out of the beautiful, the passionate, and the eternal, to awake the imagination of a people." Patrick Pearse, quote, "Ireland is not a material possession, but a spiritual reality." Unquote. Within the architects of the mass cultural and literary revival at the start of the 20th century in Ireland was a fire lit by the old stories, a taste of their power and the glimpse they give of a soul, of a self, an identity long lost to the people, a people who no longer knew who they were. Just like an individual's soul, alive in the deep unconscious, Ireland's lived in the hills and the rivers and the hedgerows. In 1902, Lady Gregory released her translated version of the Ulster Cycle, including the Tain. She said, quote, "We've kept the stories, but the meanings are forgotten, unquote. She knew it wasn't just a story, but a living metaphor, a dream. The difference now was that Lady Gregory, for the first time, translated the text into a format that was more widely accessible. It was written in plain language using Hiberno English, simple, effective, and more like the oral tradition the Irish masses were used to. And although the text spread slowly, it spread nonetheless. As the literary revival moved throughout the country, so too did the images and symbols, which began to gain energy. These riverbeds started to flow again with conscious awareness. The Irish Homestead magazine, edited by A. Russell, although an agricultural publication, became saturated with mythological themes and stories and made it to farms all over the country, giving access to the ancient Irish tales that many had never had access to before. As the translation of the Ulster Cycle proliferated and the consciousness of the populace grew, the archetype, the spirit of Hullen, energised, even in people who didn't know the tales. Personally, I think it's no coincidence that the culmination of this awakening ended in the 1916 Easter Rising and subsequent War of Independence, the trajectories of which could have been foreseen had people paid close attention to the contents of the Tain. So too could the disastrous civil war that followed. If we look at the GPO, what's in the GPO? You don't have a huge crucifix with Christ on it or any Catholic imagery. What we have is a statue of Hullen tied to his stone pillar. The terrible consequences of violence were predicted by A. Russell, who argued against the use of violence, but he was unable to stop the descent into war. I don't think any of those involved in the revolutionary days really fully understood what the awakening of the Tain would unleash. Here, amid the artillery, the bombs, the Thompson guns, was the most dangerous weapon the British Empire had to contend with. A simple book of fairy tales. One flourish of energy, galvanised by a literary movement, removed the greatest empire on the planet from a small island. Well, from most of it, which I'll come back to. Then the warrior spirit went silent, disappeared back to its slumber in the fairy mounds, or wherever it goes to sleep, and the island, utterly changed by it, lay still once again. Yeats definitely sensed something of this power being awakened just after the Easter Rising, referring to a terrible beauty being born. A. Russell, dismayed and heartbroken at the savagery and killing, in my opinion, being like most of the country under the cloak of Christianity, couldn't see the beauty in violence like the ancients could. Couldn't comprehend the ways of the war goddess, of the sacred feminine, saturated as they were in the gentleness of the Christian way. The next major translation was by Thomas Kinsella, a translation that inspired and helped Kieran Carson with his work. Of Kinsella's work, Carson said, quote, "It was immediately hailed as a classic for the vibrancy of the translation and the magnificence of its graphic accompaniment. A mass-market edition was published by Oxford University Press a year later. Its cultural impact was immense. No easily accessible translation of the work existed until then. Those that did were mostly rendered in a dutiful translatorese that did little justice to the dynamism of the original. Kinsella's radical decision to combine the English definite article with the key Irish word offered a parallel with national epics such as the Mahabharata, the Mabignon, the Iliad, and the Odyssey." Unquote. Personally, I was astonished to read that the widely accessible translation of the Tain occurred in 1969 and was put out to mass market in 1970. And as we know, the energising of the Hullen myth, the warrior or hero symbol, coincided with the outbreak of the Troubles. And again, a reading of the mythological text could have allowed an onlooker to predict the event of the Troubles and their aftermath almost to a T. From the episode in the Tain titled Guerrilla Warfare, where Hullen becomes a lone sniper with his slingshot in South Armagh and North Louth, to the descent into civil conflict characterised by the fighting between Hullen and Fair Dade, the withdrawal of the foreign army only for a deep depression to fill the void. I'll get into the similarities between the Ulster Cycle and the modern Troubles in a separate later episode. The resurgence of mythological consciousness wasn't just limited to the written word. In 1973, the Irish trad rock band Horselips released an album called The Tain, which I think further energised the mysterious symbols of Ulster mythology, with songs that mirrored characters and events in the epic. Songs like Shetanta, Maeve's Court, Hullen's Lament, Ferida's Song, Gay Bolga, Faster Than the Hound, and The Morrigan's Dream. That last song title is a clue as to why the title of this podcast is what it is. The Morrigan, a Celtic war goddess who by some accounts is made up of a trinity of goddesses, which includes Macha, who doesn't directly feature in the Tain but is hugely important, and two others, Bibe and Nemain, who are very prominent. Beyond the archetypes of warriors, kings and queens, I see a much larger cosmic struggle in the collective dream of the Ulster Cycle. That of the divine feminine and divine masculine struggling to find expression and balance in the human condition. A struggle that occurs not just in the universe and every human relationship, but in every psyche, in every soul. Psyche being the Greek word for soul, and in the very fabric of existence itself. The title of this podcast series, Acna Agus Mishnach, Wisdom and Courage, wasn't something I initially planned, but standing on Awan Macha alone one day, the idea suddenly manifested in my mind. Standing looking at the structure of Armagh Cathedral in the distance and the wide open space of the second sacred site of Awan Macha, the words wisdom and courage came, along with an instruction that this must be what the series is called, and a suggestion that this should be an Irish language title. Now, as you might have gathered from my terrible pronunciation, I'm not an Irish speaker. So I had to go home and look into what the Irish words for these were, and that kind of unlocked the whole dynamic of this endeavour. Why these words? Well, first I'll have to delve into what I mean by the sacred or divine, feminine and masculine. I don't mean men and women, because men and women are made up of both and carry what Jung described as contrasexual soul images within, the feminine in man, what Jung called the anima, and the masculine in women, the animus. What I'm talking about is masculinity and femininity as such. If we think about the universe as having two fundamental energies, material and order, which exist apart, so chaos and order, although chaos isn't the best word, the divine feminine principle is what exists, life itself, material, matter, the very fabric of birth and death, pre-cosmogonic chaos, what there was before space and time, while the divine masculine is what orders things. It holds space for the feminine. As the divine drama unfolds in heavenly realms unseen, we play out the drama unknown in our souls and minds, in our personal dreams and our collective mythology, the image of God. The masculine-feminine balance is essential for life, and one is not dominant over the other. The masculine holds the feminine, and the feminine humbles the masculine. The feminine as life force itself is dangerous. It's fire, raw energy, the animating principle, and the masculine is what contains it, and this dynamic is seen everywhere. Think of a campfire in the forest. You need to create a circle of stones to contain the fire, similar to the physical constraints of the universe, the laws of physics, gravity, the unseen order of existence. Otherwise that fire gets out of control, because it wants to burn and it will consume the whole forest and beyond, which is why the stones contain it. Similar to a cathedral, the stone container is the masculine and the praise and song within the feminine. I wonder if this is what the stone circles of the ancients were to symbolise, the containment of that devastating life force. But the fire is the whole point. The flames are the whole reason you're building a fire. Otherwise it's pointless. It's that elusive light, heat and warmth that is the only purpose for building the kindling in the first place and preparing the space. The fire provides everything. Without it you're cold and hungry and in the dark. Hinduism dramatizes this as the foundation of its religion and mythology, as Shiva and Shakti. Shiva is the divine masculine principle, pure, unmanifested consciousness that oversees the structure of the universe. For the feminine creative force, Shakti, the dynamic life energy to flourish in, to dance and twirl without consuming everything in its path. This pattern is replicated in various mythological traditions around the world. The concept of the divine feminine, of Shakti, mysteriously disappeared from the Abrahamic religions, but was very strong in the pre-Christian Irish and Celtic religions. In ancient Greece, the divine masculine and feminine was logos and eros, root word for logic and erotic, and the basis for existence. For example, the state needs to be organised for the culture to thrive. Laws, warriors, a stable economy are all essential for the arts to flourish. Ironically, without the restrictive laws of the state, artistic freedom would cease. Freedom needs to be contained for creativity or eros to flow. When there is a balance of the divine masculine and feminine principles, these unions are dramatised in myth such as Mars, the Roman god of war and masculinity, comes together with the goddess Venus, and one of their children is Harmonia, harmony. There are many, many more incarnations of this divine dance, which I will get into very deeply as this podcast series progresses. On the level of the soul of the individual, the pinnacles of the sacred feminine and masculine is wisdom and courage, akin to instinct and intellect, the combination of which produces the best way forward for the human mind. The feminine doesn't just have knowledge in the scientific or intellectual sense, but a superior, spiritually informed knowledge that is more intuitive rather than just purely logical or rational, knowledge held in the skin. Pure rationality can be destructive in its own way. For example, why not kill all useless people? It needs that eros element added, the compassion to dilute the functional cruelty of pure logical thought. Ideas formed from the body, the skin, intuition, which is why the oracles of the past, like in ancient Greece, the Oracle of Delphi, was an older lady, a priestess. Even in popular culture, the idea of the demonized witch or hag is coming back to its sage image. In the movie The Matrix, the Oracle is an older woman who can somehow see through the system and manipulate it in an almost magical way. The masculine ordering intellect reins in the Dionysian excesses of the purely instinctual, the wild, animistic excesses of the human condition without the civilizing effect of morality, structure and law. The divine masculine on its own can lead to patriarchal society, rigid authority, totalitarianism, crackdowns on creative expression. Too much divine feminine leads to disorder, anarchy, and the dreaded Hobbesian state of nature. The Irish language, it turns out, is so much more useful in talking about this because it has individual words for degrees of the same thing. Acna, interestingly a feminine word in Irish, refers to a higher wisdom, a more spiritually informed and benevolent wisdom, whereas the word gwish refers to wisdom that is shrewd, an intelligence that is smart, almost streetwise, but not necessarily benevolent or good. In the Tain, Queen Maeve demonstrates a lot of gwish, but has very little acna. She is cunning, ruthless, and very, very able to rule her kingdom. But the whole basis of the story is that she is motivated to go to full-scale war, to mobilise and endanger the lives of her province, to march into Ulster and burn and pillage and rape their way through the land, just because she wants a bull. Jung theorised that women whose masculine soul image, the animus, is not properly integrated suffer from irrational opinions, and men whose feminine soul image, the anima, is out of whack, suffer irrational moods. We see the sheer madness of Maeve starting this war purely because she cannot stand the fact that her husband has a prize bull. The Tain opens with an argument between Maeve and her husband Allil about their possessions. They bring all their riches out to compare, and the only thing that stands in the way of equality with her husband's stuff is a prize bull. Her husband owns the white bull, Finvanach, and the entire war stems from Maeve's jealousy and irrational need to equal her husband's possessions by taking the prize brown bull of Cooley. So the central animating character of the myth, the representation of the feminine, is flawed. She has not reached the fullness of Acna, and we see the dramatisation of the feminine struggle to reach perfection and the things that stand in the way. On the masculine side, we see the irrational rages of Hullen, who when in his warp spasm can't tell the difference between his friends and enemies. We also see the sluggish whining of the King of Ulster, Crothar MacNessa, especially after the war is won, when he falls into a depression and has an irrational urge to pursue the enemy for revenge. The difference in courage on the divine masculine side is between Krogart and Mishnach. Krogart is that courage that allows Cuchulainn to accept any challenge from any warrior. It's the bravery to fight anyone no matter what. The Conor McGregor type swagger, which for the purpose of winning a war is probably a good thing. But the higher form of courage, Mishnach, relates to inner strength as well. Spirit, resilience, having the courage of your convictions, the bravery to do the right and noble thing. The ability not to win a war, but to win the peace. The difference between Christ facing death rather than denounce his ideas, and Cuchulainn, who kills as many people as he can before facing his own death, is the difference between Krogart and Mishnach, in that one wants to defeat his enemy and win, while the other wants to sacrifice himself for a higher, benevolent and noble good. From the higher cosmic viewpoint, the struggles of the sacred feminine and masculine to become the best versions of themselves and unite is played out in this epic Celtic drama. Updated, edited, changed and translated by many authors, yeah, but the bones of the tale have no writers. Frank O'Connor described translating the Tain as, quote, a simply appalling prospect, endlessly scribbled over, a task better suited to the archaeologist than the literary critic, because it's an excavation that reveals a dozen habitation sites, unquote. Carson wrote in response to this, quote, the Tain might well be an archaeological site, but it need not be an appalling prospect. One could equally well see it as a magnificently ruined cathedral whose fabric displays the ravages of war, fashion and liturgical expediency, a compendium of architectural interpolations, erasures, deliberate archaisms, renovations and restorations, a space inhabited by many generations, each commenting on their predecessors, unquote. But who built the original cathedral? I don't think the structure of the story was ever written by people, but rather as the product of our collective dreams, the primordial collective unconscious, and the multiple faces of the ultimate cosmic energy, more akin to a mountain than a cathedral, something that was always there and humans simply make marks on. Earlier I spoke of the island of Ireland being energised with the spirit of Cuchulainn during the War of Independence, with the South winning its freedom. You might ask then, what happened in Ulster, the epicentre of the Ulster Cycle? Why didn't it win its freedom? It's tempting to think that Celtic mythology only affects the Irish nationalist side of the Northern Divide, and we can see Cuchulainn depicted on the walls in nationalist areas. But no, both sides in Ulster come under the influence of the land's hero archetype. Look at this mural from a loyalist area, depicting the death of Cuchulainn also. Both sides are energised by the spirit of Cuchulainn. What motivates the subconscious tends to come out in art. But because they have diametrically opposed aims, they are doomed, or cursed, to turn that energy on each other. To understand why this is mythologically, and to understand the Tain fully, we need to first delve into a myth local to Armagh, a very famous one, a story that forms the backbone of the Tain itself, the Curse of Macha, which is the subject of the next episode. These stories yell not just from the pages, but from the depths of time, constantly speaking to us and our collective soul, mapping out the evolution of our spirit throughout the ages, and for the first time it feels like I'm truly listening, and I'd like for you to join me.